I remember the sound more than the pain, the brittle thud of my shoulder against the hardwood, the hollow gasp that left my mouth, and then laughter. Not hysterical, not startled, just a quick, muffled snort, like someone watching a cartoon character slip on a banana peel. "Mom, you all right?" he asked, voice lazy, already walking past. I looked up from the floor, trying to process the moment. My son, Jeremy, stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing his coffee cup as if he hadn't just watched his mother crumple in the hallway like a dropped quilt. I pushed up on one elbow, breath shallow, cheek pressed to the warm spot of light cast by the window. My hip pulsed with pain. "He didn't come to You should have seen your face," he said with a grin, like a turtle flipped over. I didn't answer, not because I didn't have the words, but because I was too focused on remembering how to breathe through betrayal. It took me nearly 2 minutes to stand. He never looked back. Later that morning, I sat in the dining room with a cup of tea and a pack of frozen peas tucked against my thigh. The tea had gone cold. The pain hadn't. I could still hear him humming from the living room, some sports show playing in the background. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, not even the hollow courtesy of concern. That's when I began to catalog the little things, the way Jeremy left a mess for me to clean, even though my hands ached from arthritis. The way he always ate first, then asked if I wanted something after everything was gone. The way he said, "You should be grateful. Most people your age are in homes." He thought he was joking, but jokes require warmth. His were knives disguised as kindness. When Brielle, his wife, was around, the barbs got sharper. "She's getting worse, Jer," she said once. Not realizing I was in earshot. She forgets stuff, slows everything down. I'd just finished organizing the pantry that morning. Color-coded it even, but they didn't want to see what I still did. Only what I no longer was. That afternoon, Jeremy left for work, and Brielle took the car. I was alone again. I hobbled into the spare bedroom they'd grudgingly let me keep, my sanctuary of brown blankets and old quilts, and opened the small wooden box on my desk. Inside were papers, utility bills, a few old birthday cards, and a faded envelope addressed to me in my husband's handwriting. The letter inside was dated 11 years ago, a few months before he died. "If anything ever happens to me, Eliza," it read, "make sure you remember who you are. You're not a burden. You're the reason this family has anything to stand on." I pressed the paper to my chest. It still smelled faintly of cedar, of him. He never would have let our son laugh while I lay helpless on the floor. I folded the letter gently and tucked it back. My hand trembled, not from emotion, but age. I hated that, not being able to tell the difference anymore. That night, Jeremy came home late. He had fast food in one hand and an unopened package in the other. It was delivered to me, but he tore it open anyway. "Just your meds," he muttered, tossing the empty envelope onto the counter. "I'll sort 'em for you later." He never did. By bedtime, I found the bottle upside down in the bathroom sink. The next morning, I asked if we could sit down and talk. Just 10 minutes. "Mom," he said, rubbing his eyes, "I've got a full day and my knees are killing me. Can it wait?" I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I knew it wouldn't matter. Instead, I shuffled back into my room, sat at my old oak desk, the one I'd kept since my first year as a school secretary, and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. I began to write. Not a will, not yet. Something simpler. A list. I titled it Things That Still Belong to Me. My breath. My name. The deed to the lakeshore cottage. My husband's words. The way I used to be looked at, with love, not obligation. I stared at the fifth line for a long time, pen hovering over the page. I hadn't seen love in Jeremy's eyes in years. I wondered if he ever noticed that. That evening, Brielle was hosting one of her wine and vision board nights. Her friends arrived loud and early, all faux fur and oversprayed perfume. I stayed in my room. Through the wall, I heard her say, "She fell yesterday, just dropped in the hallway." It was kind of hilarious, actually. Laughter erupted. Mine didn't. That's when I made my decision. Not that night. Not loud. Not angry. I'd been many things in life. A wife, a mother, a provider, a fixer of broken sink handles and broken hearts, but the time had come to become something else. A lesson. Jeremy would never see it coming. Because the most dangerous thing about a quiet woman is that they mistake her silence for surrender. They forget she's watching. And I was. Every word, every withdrawal, every little theft of dignity. By the end of the week, I would start drawing up the paperwork. And this time, I wouldn't just write a list. I'd rewrite the future. The morning after Brielle's party, I stepped into the kitchen at 6 a.m., like I always did, even though no one asked me to anymore. The air smelled faintly of stale wine and melted wax. A glittered Dream Big poster hung crooked on the fridge, and their discarded wine glasses crowded the sink. I cleaned them quietly, not out of habit, but ritual. Every motion was deliberate, no longer something done to keep peace, but to mark time. A ceremonial closing of one chapter. By the time the kettle whistled, I'd already sorted the mail. 4 letters addressed to Jeremy, 1 credit card statement addressed to both of them, none of which were my concern. Still, I noted the return addresses: Capital One, County Tax Office, a medical billing service. The 5th envelope was mine. Handwritten, slightly creased, from Margaret Gibbons. Margaret and I hadn't spoken in nearly a year, not since the church book club dissolved after that debacle over the shack and Sister Marietta's very vocal opinions about fiction and blasphemy. But I knew Margaret to be practical, loyal, and more importantly, a retired real estate broker. Her note was brief: "Still owe you lunch. Call me if you ever want to chat. I've started downsizing and it's been clarifying. The word clung to me all morning like lint on wool." At 9:15 a.m., Jeremy appeared in the kitchen, scratching the back of his head, still in last night's shirt. "You didn't have to clean up," he mumbled, opening the fridge. "We were gonna get to it." I didn't respond. I poured my tea and sat at the table with the newspaper already folded to the local section. He leaned against the counter, chewing a bite of leftover pizza. "Mom?" he said. "Everything okay?" I looked up slowly. "Everything's perfectly clear," I said. He blinked. "Okay. Cool. You sure?" I nodded, turned the page. Jeremy shifted in place, clearly uneasy. When he left the kitchen, I waited 10 more minutes, then stood and walked to my room, careful to take the letter with me. Inside, I sat at the desk again. The sun had moved, tracing long golden fingers across the corner of the floor. I unfolded my planner and began writing. Call Margaret. Questions about property transfer. Find updated will template. Look into redirecting pension disbursement. Shred anything with Jeremy's name on it. By lunchtime, I was dressed and ready. Soft slacks, my blue blouse, the one with the tiny embroidered roses on the collar. I wore it to my granddaughter's christening 7 years ago, the last event I remember feeling wanted. Brielle stopped me at the door. "Everything okay?" she asked, sipping her green smoothie, hair in a scrunchie, faux concern painted on her face. I smiled. "Just running errands." She squinted. "Need anything from us?" I held her gaze. "No," and I meant it. Margaret met me at Café Vienna, the kind of place where the tablecloths were paper, but the coffee was strong. She looked thinner than I remembered, but more grounded. After the small talk, just enough to stitch the years together, I told her about the house. Not the fall, not the laughter, just the legal facts. Title in Jeremy's name, but mine in another. "I still have ownership of the lake cottage," I said, "and some savings they've never asked about." Margaret sipped her coffee, then nodded. "You don't need to explain, Eliza." It stunned me how heavy that sentence hit. I had been explaining myself for so long, justifying my presence in their home, my opinions, my memory lapses, my habits, my space. Margaret's words felt like oxygen. "I want to make changes," I told her. "Legal ones. I want everything documented, ironclad. I want them to learn what it means when a person stops asking to be seen." Her lips parted, and then slowly curved, not in amusement, but understanding. "Let's get you a lawyer," she said. We spent the next hour drawing up a plan. Her friend Paul worked in estate litigation, trusted, discreet, retired military, with a knack for complex asset protection. I left the cafe with his card, her hug, and something else I hadn't carried in months: momentum. By the time I returned home, the house was empty. I moved straight to the attic. Jeremy and Brielle rarely went up there. Too dusty, too cramped, but it was my vault, where everything real lived. Old tax forms, my husband's will, the original copy of the deed for the lake cottage. I found it all in a red accordion folder, labeled in my handwriting. As I flipped through it, my hand caught on something folded and yellowed near the back. An old receipt from the funeral home. Jeremy hadn't chipped in for the burial. He'd said, "We're a little tight right now. Can you cover it, and I'll pay you back?" He never did. I returned to my room with the folder under my arm and sat down at the desk. The light had changed again, softer now. Amber fading into dusk. I unlocked the drawer and retrieved the letter from my husband again. "Make sure you remember who you are." I spread the documents across the desk, lined them up like chess pieces. The cottage, the pension, the savings account. He didn't know existed. Even the old jewelry box Brielle never asked about. I catalogued it all, not for sentiment, for structure, for evidence. Then I opened a blank legal pad and wrote one sentence at the top. "For when I'm not here to explain myself." It was time. The law office was a squat brown building that used to be a dentist practice. There was still a faint minty smell in the waiting area. Part antiseptic, part nostalgia. A receptionist named Joan offered me lemon water and asked if I needed help with the elevator, even though the office was on the ground floor. "I'm fine, thank you," I said, steadying my purse in both hands. Margaret had called ahead, so Paul Hayes knew who I was before I walked in. He stood to greet me, late 60s, steel gray buzz cut, dark tie, hands like they still remembered how to disassemble a rifle in the rain. "Mrs. Eliza Marin," he said. "Margaret speaks highly of you." "She always did know how to smooth the edges," I replied, settling into the chair opposite his desk. He smiled politely and waited. I opened the red folder and slid it toward him, page by page. The Lake Cottage deed, my bank summary, a photocopy of the original will from 20 years ago, and the yellow legal pad where I'd started drafting what came next. "Do you want to change your existing will or revoke it entirely?" he asked, leafing through the stack. "Revoke," I said. "Every line. I want this one to say everything I never said out loud." Paul nodded. "You'll want to create a new will with explicit language to supersede the old one. Beneficiaries?" I didn't hesitate. "No blood heirs." He paused, pen midair. "None? My son has forgotten how to be one," I said. "And his wife treats me like furniture with complaints." Paul didn't blink. That's how I knew Margaret had warned him. "Understood. Then let's talk about who you do trust." I thought for a moment and said her name, Renee Parmenter. She was my goddaughter, the child of my late best friend, who had sent me Christmas cards every year and still signed them with a heart. She visited once a month with jam and crossword books. She asked questions and listened with her whole face. She reminded me of the person I'd been before I shrank to fit the corner of someone else's home. "Renee Parmenter," Paul repeated as he wrote. "Executor?" "Yes." He nodded again. Then we spent an hour outlining asset allocation, the lake cottage, my remaining investments, the personal items I wanted specifically mentioned, the quilts, the photos, my husband's cufflinks. "Do you want a clause preventing legal contests?" "Yes," I said. "Make it iron." Paul's pen stopped again. "Eliza, I've helped clients protect estates from manipulative family members. But I need to ask, is there any medical history, cognitive issues, anything they could use to question your capacity?" "My body may wobble," I said, "but my mind's as sharp as your tie pin." That made him laugh, the kind that lets the air out slow. "I'll need to schedule an official witness signing. You'll bring ID. I'll keep a copy of your voice affirming the choices as a backup in case of dispute." Done. Before I left, he asked one more question. "Have they hurt you?" "No bruises," I said. "Just the kind that don't show." He didn't press. I walked out feeling taller than I had in months. The bus ride home was uneventful. I sat by the window and watched the streets unfold in silence, city blocks giving way to suburban lawns and two wide driveways. A woman in her 30s sat across from me, juggling a toddler and a phone call. Her kid dropped a crayon and looked at me with wide, curious eyes. "Hi," I whispered, smiling. He beamed. His mother didn't notice. Back at the house, Brielle was pacing in the yard, phone pressed to her ear. She spotted me and waved half-heartedly. "How was your afternoon?" she mouthed, not waiting for an answer. I walked inside and went straight to my room. I locked the door, then I pulled out the letter I'd started for Jeremy. Not the one I'd give him. The one I needed to write for myself. Dear son. The last time I remember you looking at me like a person, not a problem. You were 7 years old and had a fever. You asked me to sit with you because no one's lap feels safe like yours. Now, I can't walk across the kitchen without you sighing. I folded the letter halfway through. My hands trembled, not from weakness, but from clarity. There was no salvation in explaining myself anymore. I tucked the half-written page into my journal and turned instead to a fresh sheet. This one, I labeled Things They'll Never See Coming. The new will, filed and notarized. The private letter to Renee, with instructions. The duplicate folder in the safety deposit box. The revocation notice for Jeremy's joint account access set to trigger next week. The copy of the deed in a fireproof envelope, under the attic floorboard. I placed a star beside the last one. Not because it was most important, but because it was the only hiding place I'd created alone. Dinner was silent that night. Jeremy was late. Brielle distracted. You're quiet, she said finally, not looking up from her phone. I suppose I am. I said, everything okay? I folded my napkin carefully. Everything's perfectly in place. They didn't ask more. The storm never worries when the trees don't notice the wind. I woke early the next morning. Not from pain, but anticipation. The kind that hummed behind the ribs and made my fingers restless. I hadn't felt that in years. Not since I used to organize the church charity auction and wake before dawn to label baked goods and set out folding chairs. I brewed coffee and drank it at the kitchen table, just me and the blue dawn. Across from me, the corkboard Brielle had pinned above the coffee station caught my eye again, her vision board, a collage of cut-out words from lifestyle magazines. Fertility, freedom, fresh starts. In the corner, she had taped a baby's nursery ad with pastel clouds and a sign that said "Welcome Home." Nowhere on the board was I mentioned, not in any word, image, or quote. I stared at it a long time. Jeremy stumbled in later, still yawning, his socks mismatched. "Why are you up?" he asked, pouring himself the last of the coffee. "Early bird," I said, "old habit." He nodded, reached for the sugar canister. "Brielle's thinking of turning the guest room into an office/nursery, he said casually. "We'll need the space." The guest room was my room. I stirred my second cup slowly. "Where will I go?" He scratched his head. "We've been looking at assisted living options, really nice ones, modern, with activities. You'd have your own space." I said nothing. He kept going. "It's not, urgent. But we thought maybe it's time to start planning ahead. You've done so much, Mom. You deserve somewhere restful. Restful. Like a crypt with Wi-Fi." "I see," I said. He relaxed a little, probably thinking I'd taken it well. He left for work with his thermos and a kiss on my cheek that landed more like a formality. I waited until the door closed, then pushed the vision board off the wall. The tacks popped free, one by one. I didn't tear it. I wasn't angry. I just needed the wall back. Later that morning, I sat with Renee in a cafe not far from the lake. She'd responded to my invitation with an enthusiastic "of course," and showed up in a mustard yellow scarf and sneakers that squeaked on the tile. "You look like you're scheming something," she said, grinning as she sipped her tea. "I am," I said. "But legally." I slid a manila envelope across the table. She opened it, and her face turned serious as she skimmed the top page. "You're naming me executor," she said, looking up. "And beneficiary," I replied. "You're the only one I trust." Renee blinked, visibly moved. "Eliza, are you sure?" "I'm not dying," I said. "I'm deciding. That's different." She exhaled, sat back, and rubbed her eyes. "They're going to hate me." "Good," I said. "That means it worked." We laughed, but hers faded into something softer. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you never asked for anything," I said. "And you showed up anyway." We sat in quiet for a moment, watching the town wake up around us. The lake glimmered through the window. I remembered holding Renee's hand at her mother's funeral, both of us too shocked to cry. She was 16 then. Now, she was the only one who noticed when I was hurting. "You're not alone anymore," she said. "I know," I replied, "but I need to move carefully. They're watching, just not closely enough." She returned the envelope and held my hand over it. Her palm was warm and certain. "I'll do right by you." "I know," I said. When I got home, Brielle was in my room. She didn't hear me at first. I caught her holding one of my keepsake boxes, the small velvet one with my grandmother's rosary inside. She looked startled when she saw me. "Oh, I was just tidying," she said too quickly. "Didn't mean to. This drawer sticks sometimes." "That box isn't for you," I said gently. She set it down as if it had burned her. I was trying to help. I nodded and stepped aside. "I'd prefer if you didn't touch my things again." There was a pause too long to be polite. "Jeremy said you were meeting someone this morning," she offered. I did. She tilted her head. "Friend?" I met her gaze. "Executor." Her expression didn't change, but the silence did. That evening, I baked a cobbler, not because anyone asked, but because I needed to reclaim something: aroma, memory, warmth. Jeremy didn't come home for dinner. Brielle poked at the food and said she wasn't hungry. I ate mine slowly, letting each bite remind me of the last autumn I made it, with my husband, both of us fussing about whether to use nutmeg. After dinner, I washed the dishes and replaced the corkboard on the wall. This time, I pinned my own page to it, a quote in black ink. "The people who assume you'll stay quiet are often the ones who taught you silence was safer." Then I went to bed. And I slept without dreaming. I noticed it first with the jewelry box. It was subtle. A small lid left ajar, an earring set missing. Nothing gaudy or expensive, just the filigree pearls I wore every Christmas. I didn't confront Brielle, not because I doubted it was her, but because I knew the look she'd give me if I asked that measured blank politeness that hides insult behind innocence. So I started making an inventory, quietly. Each evening after they went upstairs, I opened drawers and checked. The music box from my mother gone. The knitted shawl I'd laid on the cedar chest, folded and moved to the guest linen cabinet. Even the photograph of me and my husband from our honeymoon in Lisbon had been taken off the nightstand and replaced with a minimalist art print that simply said "breathe," as if the problem was me forgetting to inhale. I didn't say a word. I just began locking the door to my room again, not because I believed it would stop them, but because it helped me remember that the space still belonged to me, at least for now. The next week passed in careful rhythms. Jeremy left earlier than usual, and Brielle hosted 2 more creative reset evenings with her friends. I kept to myself. I watched. I wrote. Each morning, I walked to the edge of the backyard with my planner and a pencil, sat on the stone bench by the camellia bush, and updated the column I had labeled "Staged Erosion." I marked each subtle theft like a tremor before an earthquake. They weren't robbing me all at once. They were softening the ground, inch by inch, hoping I wouldn't notice until I was knee-deep in loss. But I noticed. On Thursday, I returned from the grocery store to find the house unusually quiet. I set the bags on the counter and moved through each room slowly, as if the walls themselves were listening. When I reached my bedroom, the closet door was ajar. The red accordion file was still where I'd hidden it, but the yellow notepad I'd been using was gone. It wasn't valuable, not in the financial sense, but every page was mine. My thoughts, my names, my lists. I flipped through the desk drawers, checking even the envelope slots. Nothing. I closed my eyes for a long moment and let the silence settle in. Then I went to the hallway closet, opened the cleaning bin, and took out the small fireproof lockbox I'd bought 2 years earlier, the one I'd meant to use but never had. That night, I moved the new will, the letter to Renee, and the deed copies into it. Then I wedged it between 2 bins in the attic crawl space, behind the old humidifier. If someone wanted to find it, they'd need to work harder than they ever had in their lives. And if they did find it, I'd already have the originals stored in 2 separate locations with Paul Hayes. By then I had nothing left to lose that wasn't already planned for. Jeremy came home late. I heard him and Brielle whispering in the kitchen, tones tight and clipped. "Did you take it?" he asked. "No." I glanced. "That's all," she replied. "You shouldn't have touched anything. If she notices, she already knows." Silence. Then the fridge opened, the sound of a bottle clinking against a shelf. I stayed in bed, my back to the door, eyes open, spine locked. The next morning, I made French toast and left it warming in the oven. I set 3 places at the table. By 9:30, only my plate had been touched. Brielle finally emerged with a robe and her phone pressed to her cheek. "Oh, thanks," she said absently, taking a piece of toast on a napkin before disappearing into the sunroom. Jeremy didn't come down at all. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since before my husband passed. I took the bus downtown and wandered the antique bookstore. Not for anything in particular, just the feeling of real paper, the creak of floorboards that didn't apologize for being old. I bought a used volume of Mary Oliver poems and a copy of the Constitution, just to remind myself what rights still meant something. When I returned, the front door was locked from the inside. I rang the bell twice, then knocked. No answer. I stood there in my wool coat, one canvas bag in hand, the other looped at my elbow, until I heard the latch turn. "Oh," Brielle said, pretending to be surprised. "Sorry, I thought you had your key." "I do," I said. "You locked the chain." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Right, habit, I guess." She let me in, and as I passed her, I caught the faint scent of my own lavender soap on her skin. She never used lavender before. That evening, I cleaned the guest bathroom from top to bottom, not out of obligation, but to touch something in the house they hadn't yet claimed. When I opened the cabinet to check the towels, I found the yellow notepad neatly placed beneath the spare shampoo bottles. Page 1 had been torn out, but everything else was intact. I took it, didn't mention a word, and locked it away. They hadn't read far enough to see the last entry. Some things they can take, but not all. And certainly not forever. The following Sunday began with the usual indifference. Jeremy left early, under the guise of meeting a client. Riel was on the phone by 9 a.m., pacing the living room barefoot, whispering words like timeline and placement, while flipping through an online listing of bassinets. I didn't ask questions, I just observed. The guest bathroom light had been changed. One of those sterile, bright white LED bulbs that made everything feel like a dental office. My towel, the one with embroidered birds my sister gave me decades ago, was gone, replaced with two perfectly folded gray ones, minimalist, predictable, unforgiving. They were removing me by inches. And I had given up protesting. But I had not given up listening. That afternoon, I wheeled the compost bin out to the side yard like I always did on weekends. A neighbor I barely knew was planting sunflowers along her fence line. She waved, and I waved back. "I used to do that," I said. "Sunflowers. Big ones. They followed the light all day." She smiled. "You should plant again." I didn't answer. By the time I returned inside, the kitchen was filled with the smell of something sweet. Brielle had made muffins. Store-bought mix, but dressed up with lemon zest and the kind of frosting that comes in a pouch. "We're having people over later," she said as I walked in. "Just a few friends. I'd love if you could stay in your room for a bit. It's kind of a curated vibe." A curated vibe. Like I was a misplaced object in a photo shoot. I nodded, took a glass of water, and returned to my room. But I didn't close the door. Let them see me. Let them remember that I existed beyond the edges of their weekend. I sat at my oak desk and retrieved the notepad from its hiding place, the torn page still missing, the rest intact. I flipped to the last entry and added a line. "The house may host strangers, but I am not a ghost." Around 4 o'clock, guests began to arrive. Brielle's laughter floated through the hallway, bubbly and rehearsed. Someone complimented the muffins. Another asked if the art above the mantel was an original. Jeremy made up a name. I kept track of it, all through muffled words and shadows. At some point, footsteps approached my door. A knock. "Mom?" Jeremy's voice, artificially warm. "You okay in there?" "Yes," I replied. "Just journaling." Cool, just checking." He didn't ask to come in. At twilight, I cracked the window open slightly to let the air in. The world smelled of cut grass and smoked ribs. One of the neighbors must have lit a barbecue. I imagined paper plates and toddlers chasing bubbles, things that used to fill this house when laughter had weight and welcome behind it. And then, just as the sky turned indigo, I heard it, Brielle. Loud enough, this time to carry past the vent in the floor. "She's sweet, but honestly, she's like a couch we don't know where to put. Jeremy, we need a plan." He didn't argue. He didn't defend me. He just sighed and said, "She's not gonna just leave on her own." There was a silence. Then the soft clink of glasses. I wrote in my notepad again. "They want me to vanish. I will, but not the way they expect." The next morning, I packed 2 bags. One for appearances, a small tote with knitting supplies, vitamins, and an outdated travel magazine. The other, carefully concealed in the back of my closet, contained only what mattered: the lockbox key, a backup USB drive, and the final signed documents. At breakfast, Brielle commented on my hair. "Did you style it differently?" "No," I said. "Well, it looks voluminous." Jeremy snorted into his coffee. I didn't smile. I buttered my toast slowly, evenly, and placed it back down on the plate without taking a bite. They were looking for cracks. I gave them a mirror. That afternoon, I visited Renee again. I told her to keep the letter sealed until my passing, or until she received specific instructions from Paul. She didn't ask what was inside. She just hugged me. "You're not scared?" she asked. "No," I said. "I've already done the hardest thing." "What's that?" "Stopped loving someone who no longer sees you." That night, I left my bedroom door open again, intentionally. No wedge under it. No locked drawer. Let them wander. Let them believe they were winning. Let them build their little sandcastle of comfort. They didn't know the tide was coming. And it wore a cardigan and curled its hair on Sundays. The fall wasn't dramatic. No wet floor or heavy furniture to blame. Just a slip. My heel catching the edge of the hallway runner, the kind Brielle insisted made the space look longer. I'd been carrying a cup of tea, not even full. It shattered, of course. Bone china always does. What surprised me wasn't the fall. At my age, you expect the body to betray you. It was what happened after that seared itself into my marrow. Jeremy saw it. He was walking toward me, holding his phone, scrolling through some meme or message, barely engaged with the world around him. He looked up, just in time to see me go down on one hip, knees awkward, hands out to brace the floor. I remember the sound of the cup breaking, the sting in my wrist, the silence after, and then the laugh. A short, sharp chuckle. Not cruel, exactly, just careless, like watching someone trip on a curb or miss a step. He didn't rush, didn't ask if I was hurt. He looked down, smiled, and said, "You okay, Mom?" as though it were an afterthought. His eyes never left the phone in his hand. Not really. I pushed myself upright, bones aching, pride bruised. The liquid had soaked through my cardigan sleeve. My palms were scraped. I could feel the trembles starting in my thigh where the impact had landed. "Don't worry," I said, breath catching. "I've fallen worse." He nodded absently. "Glad it's not serious." Then he walked past me. Just like that. I stayed on the floor for another moment, not because I couldn't rise, but because I wasn't sure how to carry the weight of what I now knew. That I had become a burden he could laugh at. Later, I tended to my bruises in the bathroom. No swelling, no break, just the red bloom of neglect rising under my skin. I wrapped my wrist in a dish towel with an ice pack and sat on the edge of the tub, letting the cold speak for me. By evening, nothing was said. No one mentioned the fall. No one asked if I needed help preparing dinner, or resting, or replacing the cardigan that now smelled faintly of Earl Grey and dust. They watched a movie in the living room, cuddled under a fleece blanket. I sat on the opposite end, knitting in silence. Every now and then, Brielle would glance at me, her expression unreadable. Jeremy didn't look once. And that was when I knew. This wasn't my home anymore. It was a place I'd been allowed to occupy, so long as I did so silently and gracefully, so long as I kept falling without asking to be lifted. That night, I took out the notepad and wrote only one line. He laughed. The words felt heavier than any bruise. The next morning, I skipped breakfast. I walked, instead, to the pharmacy 2 blocks away and purchased a compression wrap, a small jar of arnica, and on impulse, a single bar of dark chocolate with orange zest. Back at home, Brielle was vacuuming. "You okay?" she asked, her voice overly bright. "Just fine," I said, walking past her. I spent the rest of the morning gathering a few personal items. Nothing obvious. A box of family photographs, the small locket my mother gave me when I was 18, a first edition copy of Little Women with my name scribbled on the inside in teenager's cursive. I wrapped them in old scarves and placed them carefully into a tote, then tucked it behind the linen stack in my closet. This time, I locked the door from the inside, and I sat at my desk, staring out the window at a tree with one stubborn orange leaf still clinging to a branch long after the others had fallen. In the afternoon, I made a call to Paul Hayes. "I'd like to move the remaining documents to a different location," I said. Understood, he replied. Do you want Renee involved? Not yet, I said. But soon. There was a pause. Then he asked, Are you safe, Eliza? The question caught me. Yes, I said, but I'm invisible. He understood. I hung up and finally let myself cry, but not for long. Only enough to remember I could. By evening, the stiffness in my leg had turned to soreness. I moved slowly, deliberately. No one noticed. At dinner, Jeremy was all smiles. He mentioned his promotion was nearly confirmed. Brielle showed me a picture of a stroller she liked, asked me what I thought. It looks efficient, I said. She blinked, unsure if that was a compliment. Efficient is good, she finally decided. After dishes, I retreated to my room and opened the journal Renee had given me years ago. I hadn't written in it before. It had felt too precious. Now, I filled the first page. This is the story of how I vanished without leaving. This is how a woman folds her edges inward so no one notices she's gone. But also this is how she sharpens the edges first. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in a while. I made a full breakfast. I cracked 5 eggs into a ceramic bowl, added a splash of cream, whisked until my wrist ached. Brielle's vegan yogurt sat untouched in the fridge, and Jeremy rarely ate before noon, but I cooked anyway. Bacon crisped in the pan, and I sliced tomatoes fresh from the market stall by the pharmacy. The bread I toasted came from the bakery down the hill, not the packaged kind. Brielle favored for its shelf life. I set the table for 3, not because I expected them to join me, but because it mattered that I claimed space. They came down eventually. Jeremy entered first, yawning, his work polo half-tucked. He sniffed the air. You cooked? I nodded, plating his eggs without being asked. Eat before it gets cold. He blinked, surprised, but sat. Brielle arrived 10 minutes later, tapping away on her phone. She froze when she saw the table. Is this special? No, I said, just a Wednesday. She looked at Jeremy, but he was already chewing. She didn't sit, she poured coffee and hovered by the sink, eyeing the bacon as if it were a threat. You don't have to do all this, she said. I know, I replied. The air was quiet, but thick. Jeremy asked about the weather. I answered. Brielle commented on the smell of onions. I nodded, but underneath it all, there was something else, a shift, like furniture being moved slightly overnight. They didn't know where to place me anymore. And that meant I had room. After breakfast, I took the dish towel from the counter and dried the plates with deliberate care. Brielle cleared her throat. So, I've been thinking, she started, which never meant anything good. About what? I asked. She glanced at Jeremy, but he stayed quiet. Well, the nursery, she said. We'd like to get started soon. Paint, furniture, all of it. I know you've made yourself comfortable, and I appreciate how you've helped around here, but… She paused, as if waiting for me to ease the discomfort. We think it's time to explore next steps. For you. The words were gentle in tone, but brutal in function. I folded the towel carefully. I see, I said. You deserve a space that's tailored to you, she continued, gaining confidence. Maybe somewhere with a garden, or a sunroom, for your writing. And quiet, Jeremy added. You always said you liked quiet. I did, I replied, meeting his eyes. Until it turned into silence. He looked down. Brielle straightened, mistaking my stillness for surrender. I actually found a lovely senior complex, she said. Close enough that we could visit all the time, weekly brunches even. That sounds charming, I said. Her smile widened. So I'll pass, I added. I've made my own arrangements. Jeremy blinked. You have? I have, I said. I've been preparing, just not loudly. I saw Brielle's mind working, recalculating. Jeremy leaned back, unsure. It's all settled, I said. You'll have the room. The house will be yours. Oh, Brielle said, uncertain. That's wonderful. Yes, I said. You just won't own it. They both stilled. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sipped it slowly, letting the steam rise like punctuation. Brielle recovered first. I'm sure we can discuss everything when the time comes. No need, I said. It's already written. Jeremy shifted uncomfortably. That's a bit dramatic, he mumbled. So was laughing when your mother fell, I said evenly. He froze. Brielle opened her mouth, then closed it. I left the kitchen quietly, my cup in hand. In my room, I sat at the desk and opened the notepad again. My handwriting had grown steadier, sharp. Today I served breakfast and a boundary. It felt good, not triumphant, but anchored. Later that day, I called the moving company I'd researched and scheduled a visit for the weekend. Just a few items, books, boxes, keepsakes. The rest, I told them, would stay behind. I didn't want the wallpaper or the curtains. I'd let them redecorate over the traces of me, let them paint their new life on top of mine. Because underneath it, they'd always know who laid the first brick. That night, I took a walk by myself. The air was cool, and the sidewalk uneven, but I moved steadily. No cane, no fall. I passed the bakery, now closing for the evening. The florist had bundled up the last of the day's roses in brown paper. "Want them?" she asked. I nodded. "Red? Deep burgundy." I smiled. "Even better." When I returned home, the porch light was off. I fumbled briefly for the key, my hands stiff from the cold. As I stepped inside, the hallway light flicked on. Brielle stood there, arms crossed. "Where were you?" "Out," I said. "You should have told someone." "Why? What if something happened?" I looked at her calmly. "Would you have laughed again?" She flinched. I walked past her, burgundy roses in one hand, the scent of petals wrapping around me like armor. Friday came with a cool wind and a sky that couldn't make up its mind. The clouds rolled in and out, like thoughts I hadn't finished thinking. I stood in my room, hands buried in the pockets of my cardigan, and stared at the oak box, resting at the foot of my bed. It was the only thing I'd kept from the attic. Inside were papers. Legal, binding, final, birth certificates, marriage licenses, the deed to the small cottage I now owned 2 towns over. A photo of my husband holding our son in the hospital before either of them knew how far apart they'd grow. A copy of my new will, dated and witnessed. And the original letter, the one I had written the morning after Jeremy laughed. I sat down on the bed beside the box, the cardigan slipping off one shoulder. The fabric always relaxed when I felt guarded, like it understood my tension before I did. The house was quiet. Too quiet. In other homes, silence meant peace. Here, it meant surveillance. Every move I made was noted, not spoken of, but felt. I opened the letter and read it again. Not to revise, but to remember. If you're reading this, then you've already seen what I refused to say aloud. It wasn't a punishment letter. I hadn't written it out of spite. I had written it for truth, and in my experience, truth could hurt more than spite ever could. I placed the letter back in its envelope and resealed the box. I would deliver it to Renee myself before the move. My phone buzzed on the dresser, an alert from the bank. Jeremy had just used one of the shared household cards at a luxury baby furniture store. Funny. He hadn't said a word to me about it. I muted the screen and moved to the closet, pulling out 2 garments I had already decided to take, my husband's old flannel shirt, still smelling faintly of cedar, and a powder blue dress I'd once worn to a church picnic before my knees began to ache in the mornings. Downstairs, the sounds of light conversation floated upward. Brielle was on a video call, her tone all sweetness and curated charm. "Yes, she's still with us," she said, "but the paperwork's almost done. We'll have the room cleared by early next month. Sooner, maybe sooner." I opened the bedroom window and let the cold air in. It braced me, woke me. There's a particular honesty in air that smells like rain and rust and stone. It reminds you that walls aren't permanent. Only breath is. That afternoon, I baked one last batch of shortbread, not for them, for me. I liked the ritual, the way the dough crumbled between my fingers, how butter softened just by standing near warmth. As the cookies cooled, I slipped 2 into a wax paper pouch and placed them in the top drawer of my nightstand. For the morning I'd leave. At dusk, I wheeled the recycling bin out to the curb and paused. Across the street, the for sale sign had a red sold sticker slapped across it. A young couple stood on the porch, smiling at each other like the world owed them nothing but joy. I didn't envy them, but I remembered that feeling. I returned inside to find Jeremy waiting in the hallway. "You're quiet," he said. "Quiet people notice more," I replied. He frowned. "Brielle says you've been cold to her." "I've been honest. That can feel the same." He shifted, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's trying, you know." "Is she?" I asked. "Or just rehearsing kindness?" He didn't answer. I took one step closer, soft but firm. Tell me, Jeremy, did you laugh because you thought I'd bounce, or because you thought I'd never rise? He blinked, stunned. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that, I said. And now you have to sit in it. He exhaled sharply, but said nothing more. I passed him gently, the cardigan brushing his arm like a memory. I returned to my room and locked the door. That night, I pulled the lockbox from beneath the bed and placed it in the middle of the rug. I lit a small candle beside it, not out of ceremony, but clarity. I needed to see what I was giving away. And what I wasn't. Inside were the originals, my final will, the cottage deed, the letters to Renee and Paul, and one final envelope, addressed to Jeremy and Brielle together. I had added it recently, written in my clearest hand. I was not your obstacle. I was your origin, and even then, I owed you nothing. I sealed the box, turned the key once, and whispered, "Done." Outside the window, the street lamp flickered on. A halo of gold surrounded a single oak leaf, falling like it had chosen its timing carefully. I didn't leave in the morning. I left in the in-between hours, when the house still slept, but the birds had begun whispering outside. The sky was a soft charcoal, not quite night and not yet dawn, perfect for slipping through without fanfare. I dressed slowly, choosing my clothes as one might select armor. The soft blue dress, clean and pressed, my rose cardigan draped carefully over my shoulders. I ran a hand through my curls and pinned the front back loosely. Nothing severe, just prepare. The small suitcase clicked shut beside the bed. Inside were only the essentials. I had no interest in dragging furniture or fading sweaters across town. What I needed now could be carried. The house was still. I paused outside Jeremy and Brielle's door. It was shut tight. From the faint glow under the crack, I knew one of them had left the lamp on again, probably fell asleep scrolling. It felt strange not to knock. For years, I was the one opening doors, waking them gently, calling them down for breakfast, checking for fevered cheeks or spilled secrets. Now, I left theirs untouched. I stepped into the hallway and pulled my cardigan tighter. My bones ached. Not with pain, but with memory. This had once been my home. My walls, my rules. Now, I moved like a guest, careful not to disturb the new regime. In the living room, I left behind one last envelope, placed neatly on the coffee table where they couldn't miss it. No letter inside this time. Just the key to the safety deposit box and a note that read, "For when silence stops being comfortable." Outside, the air was brisk, but not unfriendly. The cab idled at the curb. The driver, a woman no older than Jeremy, stepped out to help with the suitcase. "You sure this is all?" she asked. "All I'm taking," I said. She smiled, but didn't pry. That was mercy. As we drove through the sleepy streets, I leaned my forehead against the cold glass. The bakery was dark. The florist's gate still padlocked. The bench by the park, the one I used to sit on when Jeremy was little, was dewed over and empty. It didn't feel like running away. It felt like reclaiming something I had let slip too long ago. "You moving?" the driver asked casually as we reached the outer edge of town. "Moving on," I said. She gave a small laugh, not unkind. By the time we reached Renee's, the sun had begun to stretch, just a pale shimmer behind the pines, but enough to remind me the day would come, whether they noticed I was gone or not. Renee stood at the door in her robe, eyes wide, arms already open. She hugged me like she'd been holding breath all night. "I wasn't sure if you'd really do it," she whispered. "Neither was I said, "until I did." Inside, she'd made tea, the good kind. Loose leaf in a ceramic pot, steeped just long enough to scent the room with bergamot and something like courage. "You don't owe me answers," she said, handing me a cup. "I'm not hiding," I replied, "just not explaining to people who wouldn't listen anyway." She nodded, sitting across from me. "What now?" "I stay with you for a few days, then I go to the cottage, and I let the rest play out however it must." "I read the letter," she admitted, voice low. "The one you asked me to hold." "And?" She set her tea down. "It's not angry." "No," I said. "It's a mirror." The warmth of the cup in my hands felt steadier than anything I'd held in weeks. Mid-morning, I called Paul. He confirmed everything had been processed, the will, the trust, the power of attorney. "You're officially a ghost," he said, present, but untouchable. "I've been a ghost for a while," I replied. "Now I'm just a well-documented one." Renee and I spent the rest of the day sorting through the small trunk I had brought. She helped me iron the linens for the cottage, labeled kitchen boxes with tidy handwriting, and even made a list of what groceries I might need. "No frozen meals," I said. "If I'm old, I'll be old properly, with real butter and rosemary." "You'll be old fiercely," she corrected. That night, I sat by her fireplace, the embers crackling low, and wrote in the journal again. Today, I left without slamming the door. No one came after me. And that's the loudest truth of all. I didn't cry. Not because there wasn't pain, but because I had already cried enough in silence. Now I was living loudly, even if that meant being alone. It rained the day I moved into the cottage. Not violently, just a gentle, persistent hush, like the sky was whispering every thought I hadn't yet dared to speak. Renee drove me out, her car full of small labeled boxes and a single pie tin she refused to leave behind. "It's like starting over," she said, easing down the gravel road. "No," I said softly, watching the windshield wipers slice the mist. "It's like stepping in where I left off before everything derailed." The cottage came into view, small and stone-fronted, with ivy crawling up the eastern side and a wooden sign out front that read Meadow End. I hadn't named it. That had been my husband's dream, before dreams got rerouted into mortgages and work hours and PTA schedules. The key turned easily. The door swung open to still air, stale with dust but welcoming in a way I hadn't felt in years. Renee helped unload, but she didn't linger. She hugged me tight, whispered, "Call if it gets heavy," and left me standing alone in a space where silence no longer felt like exile. I made tea. Real tea, not bagged. I unpacked the blue plates and set them neatly in the oak cabinet. I unrolled the small rug Jeremy had once played trucks on, and placed it under the coffee table I bought secondhand in my 20s. When everything was in place, I sat in the rocking chair by the front window and breathed. The garden outside was wild, but not unruly. Nature had tried its best to thrive without supervision. I understood the feeling. That afternoon, I wrote again. "This house will not hear apology as currency. Only truth. Only presence." It was a vow. The days passed with a rhythm I chose. No more hovering footsteps outside my door. No more waiting for my own name to become a footnote in someone else's schedule. I walked every morning, rain or shine. The road outside was quiet, the kind that curved slightly out of sight so that each step forward felt like a discovery. Sometimes I passed the bakery girl from town, blonde ponytail, always carrying too many bags. Once she offered me a lift. I declined, but thanked her. She reminded me of someone I might have raised, in a life where tenderness didn't grow thorns. At the cottage, I started cooking again. I baked a tart with rosemary and plums, one of my husband's favorites. I set a place for him at the table out of habit, then smiled when I caught myself and used the chair to rest my feet instead. On the 5th day, Paul Hayes called. "They reached out," he said. "Your son and his wife." Sounds like the letter made its rounds. I paused, letting the words settle. "And? They're confused, possibly angry." "I imagine they are. You want me to relay anything?" "No," I said. "They'll find the truth if they sit with it long enough. And if they don't," I smiled into the phone, "then I'm not their mother anymore. I'm a lesson." Paul was quiet a moment. "You've changed, Eliza." "No," I replied. "I've returned." That night, I stood in the garden under a waning moon. The rain had stopped, leaving the soil fragrant and soft. I knelt, not to weed or till, but to simply touch the earth. To remind myself what steadiness felt like. When I rose, I saw something on the gate. An envelope, taped clumsily, the handwriting unmistakable. I peeled it off gently, went inside, and opened it over the sink. It was from Jeremy. No greeting, no apology, just a single line. "We didn't know it had gotten that far." I stared at it for a long while. And then, without spite, I tore it in two. Not because it hurt, because it didn't change anything. Some people only understand damage when they see it on paper. Others need silence louder than a scream. I went back to the journal. I am not made of absence. I am made of return. And I have finally arrived. A week passed before I heard the knock. Not a polite tap, a heavy, unpracticed rhythm, like the person on the other side didn't know whether they were announcing their presence or demanding entry. I knew it would come. I just didn't know when. I waited 3 more seconds, then opened the door. Jeremy stood there, soaked from the walk up the road. His jacket clung to him, useless against the drizzle. His face was tight, trying not to give anything away. I had seen that expression when he was 8 and broke a neighbor's window with a baseball. Back then, he still knew how to apologize. Now he just stood there. "Can I come in?" "You already did that," I said, stepping aside anyway. He entered cautiously, eyes roaming over the room. It wasn't grand, just tidy and lived in. The smell of cloves from the tea I'd left steeping filled the corners. A fire cracked low in the hearth, more for comfort than warmth. "Nice place," he said, as if commenting on a hotel lobby. "It breathes," I replied. "That's more than I could say for the last house." He lowered his head and sat in the chair across from mine, the one I'd intentionally made less comfortable. He looked thinner, not sick, just ungrounded. "I read the letter," he said finally. I nodded. "I assumed so. I showed it to Brielle." "Of course you did. She's not handling this well." "And are you?" He rubbed his face. "I don't know what you want me to say." "I don't want anything," I said. "That's the point." A long pause settled between us. The kind that's only possible between people who once shared everything and now barely share air. "You should have told me you felt that way," he said, almost accusing. "I tried," I said calmly. "You weren't listening. You were waiting to speak. Or laugh." He flinched at the word. "It was a mistake. It was a message," I corrected, "that you had stopped seeing me as a person. I never meant to hurt you, but you did, with ease." He sank further into the chair. "I just thought," he trailed off. I waited. "I thought you were always going to be around. Unshakable." I looked down at my hands, veined, weathered, steady. "And that gave you permission to be careless," I said. He didn't deny it. I stood and walked to the cupboard, pouring 2 mugs of tea. I set one in front of him, without a word. He stared at it like it might bite. "I didn't come for money," he said quietly. "I came because I realized I don't actually know you anymore." "No," I said. "You only knew the version of me that served your life." He swallowed hard. "I want to fix this." "There's nothing broken to repair," I said. "Only space that doesn't need filling." He ran his fingers along the edge of the table. "So that's it? You just vanish from us?" I sat again, slowly. "I didn't vanish. I became visible to myself." His voice cracked. "You raised me. I raised a boy who understood kindness. I don't recognize the man who forgot it." For the first time, something shifted in his eyes. Not sorrow, not even regret, just recognition. He nodded slowly. "Is there anything I can do?" "Yes," I said. "Live with it." He blinked, stunned. "Live with the knowledge that I gave you everything I could, that I took the fall, literally and otherwise. And you laughed. That I left not to punish you, but to protect what was left of me." Tears welled, but didn't fall. "I still love you." "I know," I said, "but love without care is just decoration." He sipped the tea, and for a moment we sat in silence. 2 humans, not roles, not hierarchies. Just 2 people who once shared breath and time. When he stood to leave, he didn't ask for a hug. He didn't make promises. He just nodded. "I'm glad this place breathes," he said softly. "So am I." He stepped outside, and the door clicked shut. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't moved, but because something deeper than tears had finally been acknowledged. That evening, I stood by the fireplace with my journal in hand. He came, not to take, but to see, and I let him see. Just enough. The flames were lower now, glowing, like tired eyes. I added 1 more log and watched the embers catch. In the hallway, the envelope Jeremy had left behind sat unopened. I wouldn't read it tonight. Maybe not ever. Sometimes closure isn't a door swinging shut. It's standing beside it, steady, as someone else learns how to knock. The envelope sat untouched for 3 days. I moved it once, from the hallway table to the small writing desk by the window, but never opened it. I dusted around it, set my teacup beside it. But still, I left the flap sealed. It wasn't fear that kept me from reading Jeremy's words. It was certainty. Some truths didn't need confirmation. And some closures weren't invitations, they were exits. On the morning of the fourth day, I packed a basket with rosemary bread, goat cheese, and a sliced pear. The air outside was sharp, a brisk wind dancing through the trees, tugging at my cardigan as I walked to the stone bench in the far end of the garden. This was where I came to think, to remember without ache. Today I brought the envelope with me. I didn't plan to read it, but I did plan to say goodbye to the part of me that once would have. The bench was cold. I didn't mind. My hands were warm from the basket, from the walk, from everything I had reclaimed in silence. I set the envelope beside me and began to eat, savoring the way the cheese softened against the bread. The rosemary reminded me of a long ago Christmas when Jeremy had helped in the kitchen, kneeling on a chair too tall for him, his hands coated in flour and pride. That boy had been mine, wholeheartedly. The man who stood across from me last week had been a stranger, clawing at a closed door with half-formed apologies and a memory of who I used to be. I looked down at the envelope. "You're not the answer," I whispered. "You're just a footnote." The wind carried the words away. I didn't tear it. I didn't toss it. I simply folded it in half and placed it beneath the rosemary bush at my feet. A quiet burial for what didn't need resurrection. After lunch, I returned inside and opened my ledger. Not the financial one. That had been closed with the will. This was the other one, the book of names and things I wanted to remember. In it, I had written memories, not for nostalgia, but for clarity, for truth. Under Jeremy's name, I had once listed birthdays, achievements, the first time he said mama, the last time he hugged me with both arms. Today, I wrote, he returned, not to claim, but to acknowledge. And I remained, not to forgive, but to free. I closed the book, and with it, the story that had stretched across too many years in the shadows of someone else's convenience. The next week, the town invited me to speak at the library's Voices of the Season event. They had no idea who I was, not really, just that I had written a letter to the local paper a month ago about starting over in the final chapters of life. Apparently, it had resonated. At the podium, I didn't speak long, just enough. "I'm not here to offer wisdom," I told them. "I'm here to remind you that your story doesn't end where someone else drops the pen." A few people wiped tears. One woman came up afterward and asked if I had children. "I did," I said, "and I still do, but now I have myself too." Later that evening, I received a letter from Paul, a legal update. Everything had gone through the final disbursements, the cottage title, even the safe deposit keys. Brielle had sent no response. I wasn't surprised. You don't respond to ghosts, especially not the kind who left mirrors behind. I poured myself a glass of red wine, the kind I used to save for holidays, and stood by the window as the sun dipped below the treetops. The wind moved the ivy across the stone wall like it was trying to write something I couldn't read yet. And then I saw it. A child, no more than 6 or 7, running past the gate, laughing, chasing something invisible, but urgent. She looked like a memory I hadn't made yet. Maybe someone else's granddaughter. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe a future I had made room for by finally releasing the past. I watched her until she disappeared down the road. Then I smiled, because I finally understood something simple. I had not orchestrated revenge. I had offered an ending. And not for him,